First, it's always a pleasure to talk to Britain's greatest living columnist, Rod Liddle. Good morning, Rod.
Hiya, mate. Thanks for that. How you doing, Kevin?
I'm okay. I love the headline on your Spectator piece this week. The year of living contagiously. So we've
Very
been.
good headline.
It is,
Yes.
isn't it? You noted that I think it was February the 11th, or was it February the 12th, when we actually named COVID-19. So we've been going through this almost for 12 months. We're about to reach an unhappy birthday. What for you have been the highlights of this eventful and exciting year we've just been through?
Well, for me, it's been the pleasure of lockdown, to be honest. I have no problem with it at all. Being someone who fervently dislikes other people and not actually having to meet them and staying at home with my family and cooking for them every day. It's wonderful. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. It's been utterly miserable for a very, very large number of people, though, without question. And what I was wondering about was how we might have done this differently had it not occurred in 2020, but in earlier years, because as much as the politicians will tell you that they're following the science, it's not quite as simple as that. We all know it's not as simple as that. It's always contingent on what else they can do, and that was what I was writing about in The Spectator.
Yeah. You also point out that it's very much this crisis is a function of our times, isn't it? It's to do
Yeah.
with new technology. It's to do with the fact that even 20 years ago, 10 years ago probably, even we weren't just travelling around the world willy-nilly, that only a few thousand people would ever go to China from Britain.
Yeah.
And yet last year from around the world, 50 million people visited China. So we transport diseases much more quickly. I was thinking the other day that if you think about it, the vaccine rollout without new technology, without mobile phones and computers, would be absolutely impossible. So there's this sort of strange element to this crisis that it is very much a function of our times, and the government is responding accordingly. It may well not have closed everything down, contemplated lockdowns, if it was 20 years ago.
I don't think it would have done for a whole bunch of reasons. Some of them you've talked about. That not only did we not travel to China, I mean, I was back in '78, for example, China got about 100,000 visitors every year, and they were kept well away from the population. And even in 1990, very few people went to China. But also, we didn't travel abroad generally very much, somewhere in the region of a quarter of the amount of journeys that we do now. And we didn't travel within the country as much. I mean, that's the interesting thing. That, modernity, the way we live our lives now, has allowed the virus to spread. It allowed the virus to come into the country, and it spread with great rapidity because we're incredibly mobile these days. We move everywhere. By the same token, 20, 30 years ago certainly, and 20 years ago as well, we wouldn't have had home working. You couldn't have run businesses without, and I suspect. And there's one thing I didn't mention in the piece. I suspect for two reasons the government would never have agreed to a lockdown. Firstly, because the economy would simply have crashed and nothing would have been done. But secondly, I think that the way we've responded to the virus has been mediated by us lot, by the media. And there was nothing like the amount of 24-hour continual headline news of people dying, of misery porn in hospitals, of new variants of lethalities. It would have been something you maybe read about once a morning in your newspaper and were a little bit worried about. It wasn't something which was a continual fusillade of woe and misery.
In 1968, we had the Hong Kong flu arrived in Britain, and it killed 80,000 people in just a few months, and it barely made the papers. I was joking this morning with my colleagues, suppose tomorrow we just cancelled the crisis. we cancelled the coronavirus crisis, and we just literally all got back to exactly normal. So in 1968, and indeed in other times, if you go back to the Spanish flu in 1918, 1920, we didn't close everything down. We just sort of took the hit and carried on. So my question really is, do you think it would be better if we'd never have done any of this, if we'd never have locked down, in fact, barely responded to the crisis at all, and just handle it in the way we used to, which was just to take it and get on with it?
I don't know. I mean, Kevin, we differed on this right from the beginning, that I was quite in favour of lockdown. Given that we are able to work from home, given that we can protect those people who might have otherwise died as a consequence of this virus, then maybe it was the right thing to do, to lock down. Well, but we won't find out. We won't find out until we find out how many people have died as a consequence of lockdown. Because my suspicion is it's quite a lot, particularly of diseases such as heart attack and cancer. And also we won't find out until we know how far the impact upon our economy has upon the lives of people in this country. So it's very, very difficult to say. My point really is that modernity both gave us the virus and enabled us to deal with it. I mean, the other thing, of course, is that it would have been unthinkable 20, 30 years ago to have whipped up a vaccine within a year. The average time was 30 years, and some people could do it in 10 to 15 years. So given that we can do this, maybe it was the right thing to do. I'm not sure. I'm still not sure about it, Kevin, to be honest, mate.
No, nor am I. But what do you think their game plan is right now? Because what is their target? Is it zero COVID? Because if it is, we're going to carry on like this ad infinitum. And as you point out in your Spectator column, it seems that the government has convinced itself, and lots of the population now feel that we must have a government that prevents anyone from dying of anything ever.
Well, I'm afraid I do think that is the case, and that is where I think you and I come together quite a bit. I mean, there's two things. Firstly, Matt Hancock said not so long ago, when asked when restrictions could be lifted, he said, when we've got the infection rate down and when there are no variants, no new variants. Well, there is a new variant of COVID every day. I mean, there have been 4,000 since COVID first hit us. So, I mean, if that is what it means that you and I are going to be talking on Zoom for the rest of our lives, and we will never come within 2 meters of each other. The other thing is that I think that both the government and the public, partly because of the virus, partly because of being exposed to epidemiologists all the time who talk about the virus all the time, but partly also because we've changed, that we do not have a great grasp of risk anymore. I think there genuinely is a fear amongst some people that, you know, people shouldn't be allowed to die of anything. I think that seems to be pretty plain. And I don't think the government really knows what to do at the moment. We've heard mixed messages in the last 4 or 5 days. Firstly, it all seemed towards the end of the week, Wednesday, Thursday, middle of the week, that actually things were going to get much better. Restrictions were going to be lifted, and there was a great feeling of optimism around. But they've rode back on that. They seem to have rode back on that pubs may be able to open in April, but they won't be able to serve alcohol. And all. So
do they understand? Do they understand the point of pubs?
Yeah, I think that's it. And I think there is a battle going on a daily basis between the politicians who wish for us to get back to something resembling normality, and the politicians and epidemiologists and health advisors who I suspect would say, you know, we ain't getting back to normality for, 9 or 10 months.
Well, how much longer do you think we can go on like this?
Well, I don't know. I can go on like it until I drop dead. I think for the vast majority of the population, though, it's a bit different. You know, I've got a garden I can walk around in and a bit of room, and I can do my job from home. There was a meeting between civil servants and some of the media a while ago, which suggested very strongly that the government and civil servants are both worried that the public is becoming more and more fractious and less inclined to abide by these restrictions and wants them ended. And we've seen riots in the Netherlands and Germany and Belgium and so on. So I think patience is wearing very, very thin.
Yes, I think perhaps the public might begin to show that a bit more ostentatiously than they have so far. I mean, the level of compliance, I think, has stunned Boris, but I think they've probably run with it too far. What about the weird effect it's had on our political tribes in this country? Why is it now, Rod, that the people who called for our borders to always be open in the spirit of European Union are now calling for them to be shut down to absolutely everyone for months on end? Why is that?
It's remarkable, isn't it? But so is the other irony, which is that the government which wished us to leave the European Union, at least partly because we would have control over our own borders, can't be bothered to have control over those borders. We should have shut down very, very early on, back in March 2020. We should have closed our borders. 11 million people came into the country up till March the 15th, 16th. And that's what facilitated the spread of the virus. And now Labour, of course, is slightly attempting to change tack, and now feels there is nothing wrong with saying we should be able to close our borders. It's also saying there's nothing wrong with the Union flag, if the latest reports are to be believed. So I think Labour is playing a fairly canny game. I don't blame them for saying that. I don't blame them. I think there was a dispute within Cabinet, and it seems as if Priti Patel, who I think tends to get it right more often than not, was the person who said we should be closing borders. There are complications. Apparently, quite a lot of the stuff we need to combat this virus in terms of personal health and safety equipment and stuff like that comes in on passenger planes. But I'm sure there's a way around that.
Why is it that I mean, people see this as a sort of left and right issue, that if you are sceptical about lockdowns, then you must be an extreme right winger. I don't know why that is, but if you love lockdowns, then you're left wing, which is fairly crazy. But why do you think it is that Remainers, if you like, the liberal elite, are so terrified of the coronavirus and Brexiteers are not so terrified?
I think there's two or three things going on. The first thing is that the liberal left, I think, genuinely does believe that nobody should ever die of anything. They live in a fantasy world. However, it's also worth saying that there is a direct correlation between people who voted leave and people who think that the lockdown should be lifted. And this comes, I think, from this disaffection for big government, for being told what to do by big government, which the left, and the part of the left which I come from, originally, and still agree with, doesn't have a great problem with, that you do things for the good of the community, for the good of the country, rather than for the good of the individual. So I think that's where the ideological basis of that split is. And I think one of the reasons we responded so slowly to COVID in the first instance was because basically Boris Johnson is a libertarian and was aghast.
He's a lapsed libertarian.
A lapsed libertarian, perhaps, but was aghast at the notion that we should tell people to stay in their homes and do everything which we've done since. And I think it maybe took a bout of COVID for him to realise that this was actually quite a big deal.
Last question, Rod. I've found it difficult to warm to Keir Starmer, but I like his new idea about political debate, that when he gets beaten by Boris Johnson in Prime Minister's Question Time, he asks him outside for a fight. Do you think more politicians should behave like that?
We should do that. There should be more. I mean, Viz used to run adverts from the National Fight Council, which an organisation I always had a great deal of time for, which was, it's Saturday night, go and chin someone, which I rather liked. I didn't notice, incidentally, that Keir Starmer apologised later, which I think Corbyn wouldn't have done, but then Corbyn wouldn't have asked him for a fight because he'd have been...
Yeah. This is a man of peace. As he never ceases to remind us.
Well, yes, indeed. It's quite nice. A bit of fisticuffs doesn't come amiss, does it?
No, I've rather liked Keir for it. It humanised me. What's coming up in your Sunday Times column tomorrow, Rod?
Well, I'm talking about a vicar you might have a great deal of time for.
Oh, yeah, I know the one you mean.
The Reverend Gerald something Robinson, yes.
Yes. Who thinks that if we admire Captain Tom, that makes us white racists. That's
right, yes. And a man who kind of exemplifies every reason nobody goes to the Church of England anymore.
Yeah,
I mean, he's just by himself.
A man who has
yes.
Man who has fewer Christian instincts than me, and I can't say worse than that. Rod, always a pleasure to talk to you. I look forward to your column tomorrow. Thanks very much, mate. That's Rod Liddle, brilliant columnist. Read him in the Sunday Times tomorrow. He's in the Sun this week, and also the Spectator. The man is everywhere. I'm Kevin O'Sullivan, and this is Talk Radio.